Why World War II happened. The real reason. No war begins in a vacuum. The fuse for World War II was not lit in 1939 on the Polish border. It was lit 2 decades earlier, in the silence of a French railway car and in the grand, echoing halls of the Palace of Versailles. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world celebrated a victory. But in reality, they had only signed an armistice for a generation. The peace that followed was not a foundation for a stable future. It was the most potent, destructive cause of the next global catastrophe. The real reason World War II happened? It was the calculated failure of peace itself. World War I had bled Europe dry. Millions were dead. Empires were shattered. The victors, France, Britain, and the United States, convened in Paris with a simple goal: ensure Germany could never rise again. This wasn't a peace settlement. It was an act of economic and political emasculation. The Treaty of Versailles was a loaded gun handed to the next generation of German nationalists. 3 provisions in particular guaranteed war. First, the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. Germany was forced to accept sole moral responsibility for starting the entire war. This was not just an admission of fault, it was a national humiliation. The German people, many of whom believed they hadn't actually been militarily defeated, but betrayed by internal enemies, saw this as a lie imposed at gunpoint. Second, the reparations. The cost of the war, calculated at the astronomical sum of 132 billion gold marks, was levied on Germany. This debt was physically impossible to pay. It was designed to stifle German growth for decades. The immediate result was economic chaos. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the German currency. Middle-class savings vanished overnight. A wheelbarrow full of paper money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The Weimar Republic, the new fragile democratic government, was blamed for signing the humiliating treaty, crippling its legitimacy from birth. Germany's military was capped at a token 100,000 men. No air force, no U-boats, no heavy artillery. The Rhineland industrial area was demilitarized. This was not simply a security measure, it was a constant, visible sign of their inferiority and subjugation. The result of Versailles was a powder keg, ready to ignite, a humiliated public, a crippled economy, and a deep-seated, justifiable desire for vengeance against the diktat of the victors. All it needed was a match. The match arrived from America. The Great Depression of 1929 did more than the reparations alone. It shattered the global economic order. As trade collapsed, the last remaining thread of stability snapped. This was the moment Adolf Hitler, an embittered former soldier and failed artist, seized. He didn't promise a stable economy. He promised something far more intoxicating: national salvation. He told the German people exactly what they wanted to hear. You are not failures. You were betrayed. His targets were clear: the Jews, the communists, and the corrupt politicians of the Weimar Republic, the so-called November criminals who signed the armistice and the treaty. His ideology was rooted in racial superiority and the need for Lebensraum, living space, for the German master race in the East. Germany was not alone in its totalitarian turn. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established the first fascist state, driven by a desire to resurrect the glory of the Roman Empire. Across the globe, in Asia, Imperial Japan, suffering from the Depression and lacking resources, viewed military conquest as the only path to survival. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria, a region of China, in a brazen act of aggression that exposed the terrifying impotence of the League of Nations. The collective sickness of expansionism and totalitarianism had taken root. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. Within 2 years, the final checks on his power were gone. The Weimar Republic was dead. The Third Reich had begun, and the world still did nothing. From 1934 onward, Hitler moved with a brutal, almost theatrical boldness. His strategy was simple: test the waters. He would violate the Treaty of Versailles, wait for the response of Britain and France, and if no force was met, he would push further. The Western powers, traumatized by the carnage of the last war, were blinded by a disastrous policy: appeasement. They believed that by giving Hitler what they considered reasonable concessions, he would eventually be satisfied. They were profoundly wrong.
Hitler reintroduces compulsory military conscription, officially establishing the Wehrmacht and revealing the creation of the Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force. A clear breach of the treaty. Response: verbal condemnation, no action. 1936. German troops march into the demilitarized Rhineland, placing soldiers right up to the French border. If France had mobilized, the German army had orders to immediately retreat. They were too weak to fight. Response: Britain advises France against intervention, no action. 1938. The Anschluss. Hitler marches into his birthplace, Austria, and formally annexes it into the Greater German Reich. Austrian politicians who opposed him were arrested or killed. Response: international outrage, followed by acceptance, no action. The fatal climax of appeasement came with Czechoslovakia. Within its borders lay the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. Hitler demanded its immediate transfer to Germany, claiming the ethnic Germans there were oppressed. The Czechs possessed a modern army, were supported by France, and had fortified border defenses. They were ready to fight. But in September 1938, the leaders of Britain and France met with Hitler and Mussolini in Munich. The Czechs were not even invited. In exchange for Hitler's solemn promise that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand, Britain and France agreed to dismantle Czechoslovakia and hand the Sudetenland over. Chamberlain returned to London declaring he had achieved peace for our time. He had not. He had chosen dishonor and merely postponed the war. The following March, Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia whole. The most glaring, fatal lesson of the 1930s was now undeniable. Force was the only language the new European order understood. With Czechoslovakia gone, only one country stood between Hitler and the total fulfillment of his Lebensraum ambition: Poland. Britain and France, finally recognizing the catastrophic error of appeasement, guaranteed Poland's independence, vowing to fight if it were invaded. Hitler saw this as a bluff. But he still had one strategic problem: a two-front war. If he invaded Poland, the Soviet Union would attack from the east, exactly as it happened in World War I. In August 1939, Hitler solved his problem with a stroke of geopolitical genius and monumental cynicism: the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union, two regimes that despised each other and were ideologically committed to the other's destruction, signed a non-aggression pact. They also signed a secret protocol, agreeing to divide Poland and Eastern Europe between them. The stage was set. The war began not with a formal declaration, but with a lie. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland from the north, south, and west, initiating the terrifying new military doctrine, the Blitzkrieg. Lightning War. It was an overwhelming combination of armored tanks, motorized infantry, and coordinated air support, the Luftwaffe, that bypassed fixed defenses and annihilated the enemy's command structure. Britain and France finally honored their guarantee. On September 3, 1939, they declared war on Germany. The Second World War had officially begun. But the real reason it happened was not this final spark. It was the confluence of destructive forces. The humiliation of Versailles, the global collapse of the Great Depression, the fervor of aggressive totalitarianism, and the moral cowardice of appeasement. The world had 20 years to choose between a durable peace or a temporary deferral of war. It chose the deferral, and the world paid the price.
On April 9, 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. Using a terrifying combination of paratroopers and sea power, the attack, executed with lightning speed and chilling efficiency, succeeded. Germany now controlled vital strategic ports and air bases, encircling Britain from the north. The age of defensive, static warfare was dead, but the Allies had yet to realize it. The phony war ended on May 10, 1940. It was the same day Winston Churchill became Britain's Prime Minister, replacing the discredited Neville Chamberlain. Hitler unleashed the full force of the Blitzkrieg against Western Europe. His targets: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Allied High Command had prepared for an attack through Belgium just like 1914. They rushed their best French and British divisions north to meet the threat, relying on the Maginot Line to secure their southern flank. But Hitler had a masterstroke of deception and risk. The main assault, spearheaded by armored panzer divisions, did not go through the heavily guarded Belgian plains. Instead, it tore through the dense, supposedly impassable forests of the Ardennes region, the same region the French deemed safe and left lightly defended. The German attack burst out of the Ardennes, slicing across the French countryside toward the English Channel. It was a terrifying, relentless new type of warfare, achieving in days what had taken 4 years in the Great War. In a staggering tactical blunder, the Allied armies that had rushed into Belgium found themselves completely cut off, trapped against the sea. Hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Belgian troops were cornered on the beaches around the French port of Dunkirk. They were starving, exhausted, and under constant bombardment from the Luftwaffe. Their annihilation seemed certain. Hitler made a controversial, inexplicable decision. He halted his panzer divisions just miles from the beaches, leaving the final kill to the Luftwaffe. Whether this was due to logistical concerns, confidence in the Air Force, or the influence of his generals remains one of the great mysteries of the war. This hesitation offered the Allies a lifeline. In Britain, Churchill authorized Operation Dynamo. The Royal Navy began deploying every available vessel, but the sheer number of trapped men was overwhelming. The public responded to the call. From every port, hundreds of private citizens sailed across the English Channel in fishing boats, pleasure yachts, paddle steamers, the legendary little ships of Dunkirk. These civilian mariners sailed into a war zone, risking their lives to ferry soldiers from the shallow beaches to the larger destroyers waiting offshore. In 10 days, against all odds, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were rescued. They lost almost all their heavy equipment, but the men, the core of the British Army, were saved. Churchill famously declared, "Wars are not won by evacuations." Yet the miracle of Dunkirk was a profound psychological victory. It fueled Britain's will to fight on when every rational indicator suggested surrender. With the fall of France, Britain was Hitler's last obstacle in the West. He prepared Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. But to land a single soldier,
Hitler first needed air superiority. He had to crush the RAF. This was the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces and a contest for survival. From July through October 1940, the Luftwaffe pounded Britain. First, they targeted shipping and coastal defenses. Then they targeted the RAF airfields and infrastructure. The defense was led by a network of radar stations, an innovative technology that gave the RAF crucial early warning, and the young pilots of Fighter Command, flying iconic aircraft like the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Hitler's campaign faltered. The RAF, though unnumbered, had the advantage of fighting over their home territory, allowing downed pilots to return to action. In a crucial error of judgment, Hitler diverted his focus from the airfields to bombing cities, launching the sustained night attacks known as the Blitz. This was intended to break the British will. It failed. It only gave the RAF time to recover and dispersed the German attack, allowing the fighters to continue their relentless defense. Churchill crystallized the struggle into a defiant national purpose, immortalizing the pilots who fought. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. By late 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to break the RAF. Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. For the first time, Hitler's central plan was thwarted. Britain survived, becoming the indispensable fortress for the future Allied effort. Thwarted in the West, Hitler was dragged into the Mediterranean and North Africa by his ambitious but incompetent ally Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, dreaming of a new Roman Empire, launched disastrous invasions of Greece and British-held Egypt from Italian Libya. These campaigns were immediate failures, requiring German intervention to prevent the collapse of the Axis southern flank. To secure the region, German forces under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, were dispatched to North Africa. Meanwhile, German troops had to invade the Balkans, conquering Yugoslavia and Greece in swift, brutal campaigns. These detours cost Hitler precious time and resources, time that was intended for the true, overriding objective of the Nazi regime, the conquest of the East. Everything Hitler had done, the breaking of Versailles, the Anschluss, the subjugation of Western Europe, was merely a means to an end. The real reason for the war, the core of the Nazi ideology, was the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, in the vast plains of the Soviet Union. This was to be a war of racial annihilation, enslavement, and resource plunder. On June 22, 1941, Hitler tore up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive, world-changing invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the opening of the Eastern Front, the largest military conflict in human history. 3 million Axis troops, the largest invasion force ever assembled, struck the Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front. Initially, the invasion was a stunning success. Stalin, refusing to believe the intelligence warnings about the German attack, was caught completely by surprise. The German blitzkrieg sliced through the disorganized Soviet frontier forces, capturing millions of prisoners and advancing hundreds of miles within weeks. The Wehrmacht set its sights on 3 key objectives: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the oil-rich Caucasus region in the south. But this was not the conventional war seen in the West. This was an ideological war of extermination. Behind the advancing front lines, the notorious Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing squads, began the systematic murder of Jews, communists, and Slavs. For the Nazis, the war against the Soviet Union was also the beginning of the Holocaust. The Soviet Union was vast, the distances overwhelming, and the cost in human life became unimaginable. By the autumn, The German advance had stalled just miles from Moscow. They were caught by the first snows and the ferocious resistance of a mobilized Soviet population. The German army was not equipped for the Russian winter. Hitler had made the same fatal mistake as Napoleon. He failed to defeat Russia before the general winter arrived. The war of maneuver was now a war of attrition, stretching the German logistical and human limits to the breaking point. The war that began as a regional conflict, born of a flawed peace treaty, had now metastasized into a brutal, global struggle. A struggle that was about to pull the last great neutral power, the United States, into the fray.